Passem a la segona conferència de la tarda. Here is Thomas Harboe, but he wants to be called Gunny. Okay. So it's Gunny is a fellow US ICOMOS. He's an international recognized architect dedicated to the recognition, preservation, and conservation of the world's cultural heritage. He has over 30 years of experience and currently runs his small architecture firm in Chicago, Harboe Architects, with a focus on cultural heritage and sustainable design. He has worked on many iconic modern masterpieces, including numerous works by Mies van der Rohe, Lloyd Wright, and Louis Sullivan. And now, this afternoon, is going to explain us this master plan for Lloyd Wright's Taliesin West. Okay.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Pardon my Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, so you have to deal with my English. Some of you have translation, which is probably good. I'll try to speak clearly and slowly enough that you can understand me. But I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I hope that you enjoy what I'm going to share. So I'm going to talk about Taliesin West. Unlike Christian's talk, this is about the work before you do the restoration, not about the restoration itself, but it's still quite complicated. How many in the room, who has been to Taliesin West? Anyone? No one. Oh, there you go. He's a lucky man. The rest of you need to go. Maybe you'll go after this. It's a really beautiful place. So Taliesin West is one of two places that Lloyd Wright lived and worked. And they're both owned by what's known as the Lloyd Wright Foundation. And the foundation was actually created while Lloyd Wright was still alive as a clever means for him to avoid paying taxes and certain other things, actually. But he used these two places where his life was really lived and expressed, and where he got all his inspiration from. And they're very different places, and they meant a lot to him in very particular ways, which made our project of understanding this place very, very critical and was difficult. I'll explain that in a bit. The School of Architecture at Taliesin, which is the connection to this conference, I think, this was also created by Lloyd Wright as a clever way to make some money. In 1932, which was the height of the Depression, Lloyd Wright had very few projects, and he wanted to create a school to teach young architects about his ideas of organic architecture, about building architecture that relates to nature, both in the way that you use materials and also in the way it comes out of the environment that it's created in. And Taliesin in Wisconsin was very much about that, and when he found this place in Arizona, which I'll talk about in more depth, he was very excited about what that meant for his expression of architecture. The school has continued on, and very recently, in 2017, there was a requirement that the school separate from the foundation. This is due to the laws and requirements about certification for schools of architecture. So they had to force a separation, but the school still works there, and they migrate between Wisconsin and Arizona depending on the season, as Wright always did through his lifetime. As many of you, I hope, know, this July there were 8 sites that were elevated to the World Heritage List: Unity Temple, Roby House, Taliesin, Hollyhock House in California, Falling Water, the Jacobs House, Taliesin West, and the Guggenheim. And if you ever do come to the States, I hope you can go see all 8. It's kind of like having a list that you can check next to them once you've seen them. And we've had the good luck to work on Unity Temple and Roby House as well. So, why do a master plan? Well, it was actually, I think in 2014, I was asked to be on a panel or a group of experts from around the country to talk to Taliesin West about how they can go about restoring the place. And I said to them the first time I met, I said, "Where's your plan about what you want to do?" They said, "Plan? We don't have a plan." So I said, "Well, you have to have a plan. That's the first thing." And then they had a search to find an architect. And fortunately, I was able to convince them that we were the best ones to do the plan. So that was a good thing. We set about this project that took over 2 years to do. And primarily, it's the same as, well, how many in the room do conservation work? Don't be afraid. Okay. So you know, it's the same, I'm sure it's the same for you. The first thing is you have to understand what you're working on. So you need to do the research and get to know the patient. And then you have to find out what's wrong with the patient, what are his ailments, and how do you think about how you're going to fix the patient. And what are the parts that you have to make sure you keep, and what are the parts you can carve away if you need to. And that sort of thing. And then what is it going to cost? That's, of course, the client always wants to know how much is it going to cost. And then we don't have that much money, so how do you decide what to do first and how to work through on doing it over many years? Because projects like this will take a lifetime to complete, I'm afraid. So this is the table of contents as it was for the plan, how we were breaking down the plan. I'm going to go through this in more detail, so I won't read it now. We had a very, very good team, a team that we use many times. Very simple team. It's ourselves as the architects. We have a conservator that does the materials conservation part, and we were using a great architect and mechanical engineer, the man in the lower right in the white shirt, Michael Henry, who is an expert in environmental controls and understanding in a museum environment. How do you treat the building envelope in ways? And this is a critical thing at this place, which I'll talk about some more. And then a contractor to help with the construction estimates. So I don't want to read this whole thing, but the idea is that we had a methodology that we were going to use and how we wanted to approach the project and to develop the plan of how we would move forward. And I'll go through this in more detail. The first thing, of course, is the research. And we're very lucky that there's so much information. That's the good news is there's so much information. The bad news is there's so much information. And it was really a challenge, especially because in the middle of the project, they sold, Taliesin Foundation, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation sold their archive to raise money. They sold it to MoMA and Avery Library at Columbia University in New York. And so in the middle of our work, they moved the archive from one place to another. So we began, this picture is taken at Taliesin West, where we're looking at the drawings and so on. And a few months later, we had to go to, this is Tim Skovic from my office, we had to go to New York, and we spent a week in the basement looking through thousands of photographs. And it's a fantastic collection, but at this time was not very well organized. So we had to go look through many, many, many things that were not really related to what we were looking for. But nonetheless, we found some fantastic images, some beautiful original color photographs from the 1930s and 40s, like these ones at the bottom here, that really express what this place was like when it was more or less new. Very different from how it appears today. And of course, the drawings, and the drawings are fantastic. I went through the exhibit. Here you have this beautiful exhibit of drawings, and for architects, drawings always speak very strongly, and when you see the master's own hand in the drawing, it's very exciting. And in this drawing here, this is Frank Lloyd Wright's. These are his sketches, his erasure marks, where he changes his mind and then draws again and changes his mind. And this drawing has many, many workings on it, and you can see it in the drawing, and it's a very big drawing, bigger than this table here. It's fantastic to sit and look at and think about. Here's a detail, more of a detail. And in this one too, another one by him talking about the system of the panels that were open and closing, because this was a very important part of how this desert architecture was to work. And you can see, again, he's erasing and drawing over things and working. You can see his mind working. Another one, and it has his initials here, so for sure he worked on this, but I believe the other ones as well. And then once you've done all the research, and we took several months to do looking at the drawings and the photographs, then we went to the site and we spent a week at the site looking at every part of the building. It's about 8,000 square meters of building, and then there's a lot of other things that count that are outside but are really part of the building, because it's very difficult to say where the inside and the outside stop, especially with Frank Lloyd Wright, but even in this environment it's even more complicated that way. So we would look at the existing materials, and this thing had changed so many times. The one thing that was constant about Taliesin West was change. Every year when he would come back there in the wintertime, he would change things. And even though there were drawings from the very beginning, they never made drawings after that. They would just say, there were very many stories about him pointing with his cane and saying, I want you to fix this over here, or change that wall, or whatever it was. And they would, the apprentices would just go and they would make the change, and sometimes more than once, and then he would be okay. So all of this was difficult to go through and to understand how it had actually been. This was a big part of our job. When we were there as well, we had discussions, programming interviews with the people that use the building, because it also has a complicated, what we call a user group. There are the school, of course, and the people on the lower part, leaning back, the young people there, they're teachers at the school. And the group on the other side of the table, the 5 men and the woman on the right, those are what they call the legacy fellows. These are people that are still alive, that were there, lived there when Wright was alive. And they have the right to be in that place until they die. This is part of the arrangement that was made with the changeover from when the fellowship controlled Taliesin, both Taliesins, the foundation, and when it became sort of independent of that. So the men that you see there were all people that worked with Frank Lloyd Wright in the 50s mostly, and they all of them went there as young men and a young woman, and they stayed there their whole lives. So that not only do they have interesting stories, but they have strong influence on the place. And it's always a challenge to work with them. They have very strong ideas. Well, Mr. Wright would do this, and Mrs. Wright would say that, and all these things like that, which you want to understand, but you don't want to have that be what makes your decision. At least that's not how we thought of it. We had 2 important workshops, and this included experts from outside, from all over the United States, some people that worked on from Falling Water and other Frank Lloyd Wright sites, teachers from certain universities and so on, bringing together some great minds to talk about the way that we were approaching it, and to get acceptance on the methodology we were using and the ideas that we were coming up with, to make sure we were on the right path, because no one wants to be the only one. We don't have the best idea. We want to make sure that our ideas are tested and that we are working with people that really care about it, so that we make sure we make the right decisions. So the chronology, and I'll go through this again rather quickly, but Frank Lloyd Wright became enamored of Arizona in the late 1920s when he was sick. He had lung problems. He couldn't breathe well in the wintertime in Wisconsin, and his doctor told him to go to the desert. So he went to Arizona in the 20s, and he got a commission of the Biltmore Hotel, which never was constructed, but he spent a lot of time there. The San Marcos in the Desert project was the big one. And it was also at this time that he began to get the idea of having the fellowship, where he would have young people come and actually pay they would pay Frank Lloyd Wright to work for Frank Lloyd Wright. That's how it worked. And they called it a school. By 1937, he'd been there many times already, and that's when he finally made this discovery of the site. And I'm going to read this. I think it explains how important this place was to him. And this is from his autobiography. Finally, I learned of a site 26 miles from Phoenix, across the desert of the vast Paradise Valley, on up to a great mesa in the mountains. On the mesa, just below McDowell Peak, we stopped, turned, and looked around. The top of the world. Just imagine what it would be like on top of the world, looking over the universe at sunrise or at sunset, with the clear sky in between. Light and air bathing all of the worlds of creation in all the color there ever was, all the shapes and the outlines ever devised. Neither let nor hindrance to imagination, nothing to imagine, all beyond reach of the infinite mind. Well, that was our place in the mesa, and our buildings had to fit in. So he had this epiphany, he had this incredible vision of being there, and you can see, I mean, there's nothing but desert. It's not like that now, but at that time there was nothing but desert. And so this is, again, organic architecture. Things had to come from the desert, come out of the desert. And so he very excitedly, he wrote back to all the people that were back in this was in December of 1937. He wrote a telegram. It said, weather warm, brightful, sight in hand. Come, Joe Cake, soon as you are ready. That's a place. Bring shovels, rakes, hose, and also a hose. 18 drawing boards and tools. They're architects, remember. Wheelbarrow, concrete mixer, small kohler and wire. Melodeon oil stoves for cooking and heating, water, heater, viola, cello, and rugs. He loved music. I mean, music was an incredibly important part to Frank Lloyd Wright, and everywhere he went, there had to be music. So it's not a small thing that he asked for. Of the few things he wanted music. And here you see him, that's him in the upper right-hand corner working on the plan. And there again is a drawing of his idea of what this should be, and it's really how it came to be. So we broke it down, looking at different distinct periods of construction. This is the first phase of 1937 to 45. Which, of course, is right after the war. And then from 1946 to 59, there was a large increase after the war. There were many soldiers that came home, and they got the permission to go to school. They got funding from the government, and this increased the number of apprentices or fellows that went to the school, and therefore they had to expand the place in order to accommodate everyone. And of course, 1959 is the year that Wright died. So here's what it looked like. This is what it looked like just before Frank Lloyd Wright died in 1959. And then from 1960 to 1985, this is the period of Oglavana Wright, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's wife, and she was very influential in many ways, particularly on the people that lived at Taliesin and Taliesin West. And these are the changes that occurred. There was a big fire. I don't know if this, This building here burned in 1963, so they rebuilt it, and there were large parts of this that were added and changed in that time period. So in 1985, Oglavana dies, and the foundation takes over. This is it in that mature period, we'll call it. And then from the time that she died to today, there were also other changes that were made. That's what you see in the lower right-hand corner. So as you can guess, this is a very complicated history of construction and trying to figure out what's what. This is how it looks today. Opposite view from before, but nonetheless, the city has come right up to the border of the place. And now it's about, I don't know, a hectare, an acre, 700 acres. I don't know what that is in hectares, but it's a large piece of land, but nothing like it used to be. It was 3 times that big before. And the urban environment is beginning, or suburban environment is really getting to encroach on the desert. So then we looked at each piece. As I mentioned, it's about 8,000 square meters in total, and it has some very strong individual components. So we looked at each one, broke it down so we could handle each part of the building individually, starting with the drafting studio, probably the most significant space, which is where he worked and taught. And there are lots of photographs of this and how it changed over time. And here you see one of the things that is so fascinating is the way that these panels that are made of fabric, canvas fabric, they were used in a very dynamic fashion that would open and close depending on the weather and allow ventilation, natural ventilation, to come in and try to keep the water out, although it never did that very well. Anytime it rained hard, water would come in. It's still a problem. There they are. Almost every year they had to make new panels. And they kept changing the way they installed the panels because the system was not working very well in most cases. This is again the drafting studio showing the changes over time, and this is sort of the end of the season. This is Easter. Every year after Easter they would pack up everything and then they would move to Wisconsin for the summer. And the same in the fall around Thanksgiving they would come back down to Arizona. Those were the seasonal migration that they would have. And here you can see how it changed in the lower right-hand corner. That's the school today. That's where they have the school. The students still occupy the same spaces. Of course, now they use computers instead of drafting tables. You can see how the ceiling panels on the lower left-hand corner, how they're different. They went to a fiberglass panel, and now they're sort of a plastic panel, and that isn't working very well either. And then we looked at each other component. Frank Lloyd Wright's office, same sort of a story. I'm going to go quickly because we don't want to take too much time. But anyway, this lower left picture is a beautiful color photograph from 1949. It's very well documented. It was published many, many times, so there's a lot of good photography. This lower left, that's how his office looks today. The dining room, this is a space that has had a lot of change. This picture on the left is original, and then they started cutting a hole in there so you could go out to the south, directly out. It's now used, it's called the boardroom. Originally it was the dining room. That's how few people there were. They could all fit in there to eat. This just had a restoration of the roof that they just fixed. This room changed a lot, many times. This is what was called the dining room. This was part of the expansion when after the war they needed more room for people to eat. And in 1970, you see on the upper right-hand corner, they basically demolished everything and rebuilt it new. This is long after Wright is dead, and his son-in-law, Wes Peters, who ran the architecture office, he oversaw the reconstruction of what was the dining room. So there's a lot of steel installed in there that never existed in Wright's life. And then this is the living quarters, the garden room, which was where Frank Lloyd Wright and his wife and daughter lived. That also changed many times. He entertained many famous people there because he had a lot of interesting friends, intellectuals from all over the country. They would come and visit him there. And I hope you can sense how much it changes. Every time there's almost every year he changed things. This in particular changed. This originally was where these were the highest people in the group lived. His son-in-law and daughter lived on in the left cave, I call them, and then the middle one was Gene Maslink's office, his living quarters. You'll see him in a second. Now they built a roof over it and made it into a conference room, which really changed the whole way that you perceive the front of the building. So then, once we understood, this is all just to get an understanding of the place. Then we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to make decisions about this place? So we began to. This is about the climate. Understanding how the buildings were used for that. I mentioned the dynamic panels, really an important aspect of how they use the buildings. And if there was a fireplace in every space, every living space, so at night when it was cool or cold in the desert, you could have a fire. And in the daytime, you would open the panels. And that's not unlike, I'm sure, many parts of Spain that have a similar kind of a climate, where you can live outside pretty much all the time until the summer when it gets absolutely too hot to be there. So we wanted to understand both how they had used it in these times and also how it's used today. Now, everything has been sealed up, and they try to put air conditioning in it, and it's terrible. Waste of energy, and it still doesn't make it very comfortable. It's just too hot. So this is one of the big dilemmas of how to use this place, because it's lived in now all year long. We wanted to understand how they had made improvements and so on. And as I said, the air conditioning didn't come in until after Wright was dead. That's something Oglavana did, because she wanted to live there year-round. And it changed the architecture significantly. So in trying to understand what's important, how do we protect this thing, and how do we return it more to what it was like, we had to understand the significance, as we call it. And these are criteria, and there's 4 criteria that we use in the US for our National Register. One thing is events, the association with the fellowship is the important aspect of that. Of course, a person, Frank Lloyd Wright. The design and construction, this is primarily the way we talk about great architecture in the US, and what are the distinctive features that make this an important lesson in how we were building and so on at the time. And also archaeology. There's a lot of interesting archaeology here. It was a very sacred site for the native people that lived there before. And Wright picked up on that, these petroglyphs on the rocks. He found those nearby on the site, and he took the particularly ones he liked, and he would move them to specific places within the site of his buildings so that they became a part of the whole procession of how you understood the site. The procession, the way you move through the site, is really, really important. So we also wanted to look at it from a values-based approach, not just those criteria that is more a little cut and dry. These are a little softer and nuanced in how you think about what is it that makes these things important. So we looked at the values derived from the historic and aesthetic qualities, and these are some of those things that we took into account. The experiential values, how you feel when you are in the place. What are the things that go on there that make you see this place in a different way than any other place? And the experimentation, architectural experimentation, and seasonal camp, those are really critical and important things about how to understand this place. Social values, the idea of sense of community. How is it used? How do people live there together? Who are the different kinds of users that are there? Of course, now it is a tourist place, so that has also other aspects to it. And of course, it has a real economic value. The value of the property itself is very high, given all the construction and development around it. And it has revenue that they generate from the touristic trade that has an important aspect to allowing the place to continue and so on. It's a place of employment. There are about 60 people that work there full-time, and a lot of part-time tour guides and so on. So once we had this overarching understanding of why it was important in all these very complicated ways, then we began to look at the buildings themselves, the parts of the building, and say, how do these values, how are they manifested? How do they express themselves in the physical place? And then we looked at each one of the components and tried to make those connections to the buildings, the building parts that are there, the parts that are missing, and how did they change? There's a lot of sifting of both the documentation, but also all the soft ideas about what's important with this place and how we understand it to be. So we made zones. Zone 1, those are the critical things that make Taliesin West Taliesin West. Those are the things that we must really focus on and preserving and conserving and somehow enhancing, so when people go there in the future, they can understand that this was the place, this is what it meant to Wright and the people that came with Wright and beyond. And the secondary places, they have some of those characters, but not so much. The third zone 3, these are places that were built or changed so significantly after Wright was dead that Wright would never recognize them. And so those have less importance, and there's more flexibility in what you might do there. And zone 4, these are things that were conceived of way beyond after Wright was dead, and in some ways have gone against the ideas of what Taliesin West was supposed to be like this, this meeting room on the lower right. The problem with the meeting room on the lower right is that it's one of the most used spaces for the school. That is a very important seminar room and conference room that they use all the time. We also wanted to understand it from the experience. I mentioned the procession. How do you move through the space? This was incredibly important to write about a sense of space and moving through the space and the views that you get, and all those things are clues and important aspects to getting a full understanding of what this place is like and what it meant to him. It was all in his head. As I read that expression to you, that is about what he wanted you to feel when you went there. And it's very present, but it's been eroded to some degree, so we wanted to find ways to try to strengthen that. And then after all this research and then the analysis and so on, then it was a discussion about what are we saying, when is the most important time? In the United States, they have this thing they call the period of significance, which actually personally I don't like that much, because the building, it's not that it stopped being significant in 1959. It's just that it was more important. That period is the most important time to recognize. So we call it the primary period of significance. It's not the only period of significance. It's a subtle thing, but there is an important difference in how we think of it. And this, of course, is Wright's lifetime, when he built it and when he died. That's the most important part. But things are there from after that also need to be recognized with Oglavana's leadership there. So then from that, we devised these principles to preserve the elements and materials from that period that are still there, primarily all the concrete and stones, all that desert masonry, as he called it. That's all pretty much original to Frank Lloyd Wright's lifetime. And then how do you look at and evaluate these changes that were made and make decisions about what still is in line with what he wanted and what he experienced when he was there, and what is so much beyond that you want to try to maybe change or remove. And you should always be recircling on this idea so that when you're making decisions, 20 years from now, they can still be thinking about that in a similar way. And then again, these different zones have different attitudes about how much freedom you have and what you do there. So from that, now we begin to look at, okay, what has to happen? Now you've done all the testing, you've analyzed the patient, you know that they're sick, and how do you fix them? And then you have to decide, what do you have to do to start returning things? And this is where it gets very scary, because each one of these decisions has a large dollar or euro sign next to it as to what it means to make that change. And of course, you have to deal with the outsides of the buildings and protecting them from the outside environment. And then you look at the insides of how the buildings are used. And again, it's very difficult now because they use this building all summer long, which it was never intended to be. When it's 45 degrees in July and August, and the air conditioning doesn't work very well, it's very uncomfortable in those spaces. And then, so then we went through each one, again, each building component, the larger components, the studio, the drafting studio itself, looking at that, what does this mean to make these incursions, and what are we going to do? You see that one on the upper right, this is such an evocative, beautiful image of how open and free it is. And now, of course, it's all enclosed, trying to put the air conditioning in there. It just doesn't work. The kiva, which is one of the key social spaces of the building where they used to have a lot of important meetings and so on. You see the vista on the lower left where you see that important view that was framed very intentionally. And there's a petroglyph that in the lower right that he added later that was put there specifically for part of that whole view shed and the way that you experience the space. And the one on the lower right, that's how it is today in there. This space is one, again, that had changed many times where they built the steel. So there's more flex. You see, again, on the upper right where it was completely rebuilt and completely different kind of usage today. But to undo that would be very difficult, very difficult. Sun Cottage was the original place that Wright lived. That was transformed many times, and today is very different from what you can see. Again, they built it basically down to the walls and then rebuilt a new building there. The only thing that's original is the fireplace in the upper right corner. That's from 1938. This is that room I mentioned, the Wesley Peters, where they were living in. It was like living in the cave on the rock of the mountain. And now on the right, that's all covered up with a glass wall. Totally different experience. So we'd like to take that away, but I don't know if they ever will. That was our recommendation. So then we look at, okay, there's the big plan. Here's what you need to do. There's about $30 million worth of restoration that maybe they need to do, but they don't have any money, so where do they start? And there are a few things that are very important, dealing with the roofs because the water comes in. The water tower had to be fixed. A lot of little things that they needed to do, including the restoration of the Whitman Square, as it's known in the lower right. He was a lover of poetry, and he loved Walt Whitman, who was a great American poet who wrote about nature. And there's a quote in this place. They restored that very nicely recently, and it looks really good what they did. Again, we prioritize. These are the things they have to think about moving forward. And for the architects in the room, you know, when you do a plan for a client, and then the biggest recommendation of the plan is they need another plan, they're not always so happy, but sometimes that's the reality of what they really need to do because they weren't willing to pay you to do all the planning you really needed to do. So there's all these other things that they need to plan. And most important is the cultural landscape plan, understanding that we just looked at buildings. That's all they wanted us to look at. That was their choice. We said, well, you need to understand the buildings in the environment. How do they work together? There's a lot of things in the desert, places, sites where the tents were, where all the fellows lived out in the desert in a tent. And all the remains of that is still there. Those all need to be understood and interpreted and restored, or not restored, but at least protected. We need to do more research. We had a very limited budget for what we could do for research, and also doing material analysis, which we never got to do. And then, you know, what do you do next? And the most important thing for us in our work, and probably for you here too, is you do mock-ups. You have to do trial experiments about fixing things and how do you do it. What's the best way to do it? You try to understand the materials as best you can, and then you make a trial and you say, okay, this is how I think it should be. This is the way the material works. This is the way it goes together with the old material. How is it satisfactory or not? All those things, they need to be done again and again until you get it just right. And one of the big things we want to do is this fabric roof system. I mentioned that it's changed many times, and all the roofs are in time. It's time now to change the roofs again. They're failing. So what do we do? And they would like to go back to something that's more like what Wright had. Not canvas probably, but maybe a fabric panel of some kind. That we can have a new modern system using technology in a little better way that looks more like the way Wright experienced it. There was something about the filtered light that came through the fabric that he really liked. And how can we come closer to that with using modern technology to create something? And we're waiting for some money. If they get the money, we're going to do a mock-up on his studio, on his office building. These are the prioritizations. And then new construction. One of the big things they want to do is to create a new visitor center. Because right now it's very puts a lot of burden on the existing historic buildings to have the visitation the way that they do it now. So if they could have another building, a new building that would then be a place for interpretation, that would be a really good thing for them. But again, they need many millions to do that. Then how much does it cost? They want to know that, so we had to go through that. And everyone was shocked at the end when it's found out how much it cost. There are the air conditioners I mentioned. Very inefficient. Soft costs, how you have to pay your architects and engineers, of course. We don't do it for free. So that's what I had to share, and I think we'll have a discussion later, and I'll be happy to answer your questions then. So thank you for your attention.